What I'd like to talk about tonight is to just give you an overview of the prehistory of the Sudbury River drainage, the general area around the towns of Sudbury, Wayland, Framingham, as far up as the headwaters in Westboro, and a little bit about the area around the confluence of the Sudbury and Concord rivers in Concord. And this is an area that has a really long history of archaeological investigations, and I feel as though that and some of the other people that are active in archaeology around here are carrying on part of that long tradition, which actually goes back over 100 years. And some of the first archaeologists in this area were some well-known people, including Thoreau and some of the transcendentalist connected people in Concord. So there's a very long history of interest in archaeology by both avocational or amateur archaeologists and professional archaeologists. So I'd like to just give you a little bit of an introduction into that history, and then with an overview, and then show you some pictures of typical artifacts and aspects of different prehistoric archaeological sites that cover about a 9,000 to 10,000 year time span. And we have sites that go back that far in this area, so there's a long, a lot of time depth. A lot of people think of prehistoric sites, they think something that's old might be maybe 1,000 years old, but we've got perhaps sites that are perhaps as much as 10,000 years old. So, can you see the slides all right?
No.
Can't see them at all?
Very washed out.
Sorry? This way?
This light washes out.
Does it? What can we do? Okay. Yeah, if we can leave that light in the back on. If I turn this light on, it's gonna it's not gonna the video's not gonna work. How's that? Okay, great. The combined Sudbury-Concord river drainage and some of the lower end of the Assabet drainage has been and still remains one of the most intensively investigated areas or river basin areas in Massachusetts in terms of what we know about prehistoric settlement, land use patterns, and resource use patterns. And as I mentioned before, there's a long history of over 100 years of antiquarian, avocational, and professional archaeological interest in the area, and that has left behind a large body of information. A lot of it is in the form of artifact collections, and some of the information has been published. And I would divide the information that we have into a couple of general categories, which would be artifact collections, which have varying degrees of what we call provenience or locational information, and other information that's been collected by avocational archaeologists, mostly members of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, and information that's been reported on and published by professional archaeologists, which has been a fairly recent thing, mostly since the mid-1960s. And public archaeology or contract archaeology that I'm involved in is something that started in the mid-70s with the passage of some key pieces of state legislation. And so we have almost a 20-year history of that type of archaeology, and that's contributed a lot of new information. In fact, most of the new information about prehistory comes about from investigations that are carried out in the context of contract or public archaeology. As I mentioned, the history of investigation goes back over 100 years. Some of the earliest collections from the Concord area were started perhaps in the 1860s. And Henry David Thoreau, who's well known, was an avid artifact collector, and his collection is still curated in a couple of places at the Peabody Museum in Harvard and at the Fruitlands Museum up in, I believe that's in Princeton or the town of Harvard. And he was important in arousing a lot of interest in this in prehistory. And one of the things that he did was to investigate a rather rare site, which was a freshwater shell midden. It was popularly known as Clamshell Bluff. Right now, it's where Emerson Hospital is and where the bridge over the Sudbury River, where the Route 2 bridge over the Sudbury River is. And that was a site that was fairly conspicuous because there was a large deposit of freshwater clamshells. And Thoreau and some other people began to investigate that site probably sometime in the 1860s. And I think he probably even published at least one description of that, which you can still read. And his accounts attracted the interest of some of the other antiquarians in the area, mostly there were a few people at Harvard University who noticed that and became interested. And also at that time, one of the things that was going on was a lot of intensive market gardening in the town of Concord. There was a lot of gardening that supplied fruits and vegetables to places like Quincy Market. And what that caused was intensive agriculture on some large areas of land. Some of the best land was along the Concord and the Sudbury rivers. And that plowing and really intensive agriculture exposed a lot of prehistoric sites. And there were collectors, mostly in the Concord area, who would go out and visit these sites. And a lot of areas were under cultivation, so it was easy to do this. And that's how some of the largest collections were assembled. There were some large, what we call multi-component sites. Those are sites that have been occupied sporadically over thousands of years in the Concord area that supplied artifacts to a lot of collectors. And that was a major activity for the avocational archaeologists and antiquarians in the area, probably beginning in the post-Civil War period, at least by the third quarter of the 19th century. And some of them were able to assemble some very large collections, numbering in the thousands of artifacts from these prehistoric sites that were annually plowed and cultivated. Some of those collections are still curated in Concord, I believe in the Concord Public Library or in the Thoreau, I believe it's the Lyceum over there. And they date, there are some that date from as early as 1860 and then up to about 1920. And two of the earliest collectors were Alfred Hosmer. He collected from about 1892 to 1903, and Adams Tolman from about 1890 to 1920. They were both residents of Concord, and they collected mostly in Concord, but in the towns of Wayland and Sudbury as well. Wherever there were prehistoric sites that were easy to get to that had been exposed by farming. Following that, one of the earliest attempts to conduct a systematic survey of prehistoric sites in the combined Sudbury-Assabet-Concord drainage was a thing called the Merrimack Archaeological Survey, which was carried out in the years 1930 and 31 by Warren Moorhead, who was an archaeologist employed by the Robert S. Peabody Foundation in Andover. He had done a lot of archaeology in Maine and along the Merrimack River in New Hampshire, and those surveys were so productive that he felt that if he looked at the lower end of the Merrimack drainage, which included the Concord, Sudbury, and Assabet river drainages and part of the Shawsheen as well, that he might come up with some other new information. When he carried out that survey, he needed some local expertise, so he contacted a person who was considered, I think, to be one of the leading amateur archaeologists or avocational archaeologists in Concord, and that was Benjamin Smith, who some of you may have heard about. And Smith shared his knowledge of prehistoric sites in the Concord area with Moorhead and contributed a chapter at the end of Moorhead's report specifically dealing with the Concord drainage. Unfortunately, the conclusion that they came to was that most of the prehistoric sites had very little research value because when they went out and dug test pits on those sites, they found what they felt to be was very low densities of prehistoric artifacts and other cultural material. Now, of course, Moorhead had been working in Maine and on some of the big sites in the Merrimack River in New Hampshire, which produced some really spectacular finds. So when he came down here, and if they only found a few what we would call projectile points or arrowheads and pieces of flaking debris from where people made stone tools, that would have seemed unimpressive to him, whereas probably today we might consider that stuff to be more significant. So you have to view that in the context of when it happened. Another thing they noticed was that the previous really intensive artifact collecting in Concord might have removed a lot of the artifacts that were originally on those sites. Moorhead noted that he thought over 20,000 artifacts were already in private collections just in the Concord area alone. So that gives you some idea or some measure of the intensity of the collecting. That's by our standards today, that's just an incredible amount of material. After that attempt, Ben Smith on his own conducted some survey work in this area, mostly in the years 1940 and 1941. In 1939, the Massachusetts Archaeological Society had been founded by a small group of both amateur and professional archaeologists at the Peabody Foundation in Andover. And one of the first things that they decided to do was to collect some sort of systematic database of prehistoric sites in the whole Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so they divided the state up into different areas, and people were put in charge of collecting information from those areas. Ben Smith took the Concord area, since that was the area he knew the best, and went around and talked to a lot of other amateur archaeologists and collectors, and it was a very successful data collection. He identified over 130 sites just in the Concord quadrangle alone. So that's mostly the town of Concord, some parts of North Sudbury, just in that area. And a lot of those sites are still on the state level inventories that are maintained by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So we still use that data today. It was important when it was collected. It's still important now. And what that did was make that area, particularly around the confluence of the Sudbury and Concord rivers, one of the most intensively investigated, one of the best documented areas in Massachusetts as a whole. We had some of the best site locational information. In many other areas, there were towns that maybe had one or two known prehistoric sites, if any. Smith later went on to try to analyze some of the data on prehistoric site locations to see if he could determine patterns, what areas, what types of locations or environmental settings were selected for settlement by prehistoric people. And he published that in an early bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And right about that same time in the 1940s, one of the other important things that happened was that a local chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society was started in this area, and it was called the C.C. Willoughby chapter. It only lasted for a few years, but one of the things that they did, one of their projects, was to take on excavations at one of the larger known prehistoric sites known as the Davis Farm, which is in the area of Nishotic Golf Course near the Sudbury-Concord town line. And some of the information that they were able to record from that site included a possible prehistoric house floor that was outlined by what we call post molds. Those are small stains in the ground that might mark areas where wooden posts had rotted out. And some other important information, and that information was also published in an early bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Smith himself continued to collect. His collection is now curated in Concord, and it's one of the better documented collections from this area. And following World War II, during the rapid expansion of suburban development in this area in the 1950s and 60s, because the C.C. Willoughby chapter of the Mass Archaeological Society no longer existed, there were fewer avocational archaeologists that were active in this area. There were still some that continued to carry out their own work, but it's likely that a lot of prehistoric sites were destroyed before they could be documented during that development. That's an important period in terms of recent land use, because from just looking around here, it's always been my feeling that a lot of sites were probably destroyed before they could be recorded. Some of them may still survive. In the past 20 years, there's been more of an increase in both avocational or amateur and professional interest in the area. Excavations by the Ekblad chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, which is based in Worcester but has quite a few members in this area. They've been doing a lot of work in the upper Assabet and upper Sudbury drainage, mostly in the town of Westboro. And the Wayland Archaeology Group, which is a subgroup of the Wayland Historical Commission. We have some Wayland Archaeology Group members here tonight. They've been doing a lot of work specifically in Wayland since about 1978. And that's, both of those groups have collected a lot of important new information. One of the things that this is just a general view of the Sudbury River from the east slope of Goodman Hill. Some of you may recognize this. And what's important about this is this, what I'll refer to as a riverine environmental setting, which is the river itself and the broad open marsh environment, and then some of the wooded wetlands that fringe that. That's important throughout the entire prehistoric period. That's where, because of the natural resource base that was of plants and animals that were in that environmental setting, that was a real focal point of prehistoric activity. So that's sort of a common reference point. And, oops, going the wrong way. Yeah, this shows some of the known prehistoric site locations, just very generally, to give you an idea of the large amount of sites that were recorded by Ben Smith and the other amateur archaeologists in the Concord area. Here's the confluence of the Concord and Sudbury, or the Assabet and the Sudbury rivers forming the Concord. You can see the cluster of sites up there. Some of that is a factor of the really intensive collecting activity that went on in that area. And then further down, you can see how the sites are very clustered near that riverine wetland setting, and you have smaller numbers of sites along these tributary streams. Now, there are probably more sites along this stream network that we don't know about, but because most of the previous work has taken place along the main branch of the river, that's where most of the known sites are. And that's one of the biases, one of the slants in the data that we know about. I mean, this is indicative in some ways of where most of prehistoric activity took place, but there's a bias against sites in upland areas just because those sites tend to be smaller, harder to locate, they're easily destroyed, and those sorts of things. Oops, keep hitting. This is just an outline map of the town of Wayland, just to show you what the Wayland Archaeology Group was able to do. These were the known prehistoric sites in Wayland before, well, let's say in 1978, and all of these sites were sites that have been located by members of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. There were about, I think there's about 15 sites there, and the relative size of the dots is just a rough approximation of the estimated size of those sites, and these large ones are probably base camp sites that have occupations that span thousands of years, and they're mostly along the main part of the river. And then I want to show you what happened as a result of a survey that the Wayland Archaeology Group carried out in 1981. They had a survey and planning grant from the Mass Historical Commission to inventory prehistoric sites in the town of Wayland to upgrade this database. And this is sort of a before and after shot. This is the known distribution of sites following that. There was a two-phase survey. And what they did was go out and field check previously reported sites and talk to, they did a lot of interviewing, talked to people in town who had found arrowheads or other Indian material on their property, went back and looked through some of the old collections, and they were able to add a lot more sites to the database. Quick question.
Give us a reference point in some of these maps.
Okay, yeah, this is,
20 years or something.
yeah, here's Herd Pond. Route 20 goes, here's where the Wayland landfill is. Route 20 goes across about like that. Let's see. 27's right here by, this is Baldwin Pond, 27 goes across like that.
How about the Wayland High School?
I don't know, that's down, what, down in here somewhere? So anyway, the other thing that this did was show that there's a real range in the size and complexity of prehistoric sites. Most of the sites that we knew about before were these larger sites. After the survey in Wayland, they knew about a lot more smaller sites. Some of these are even just what we call find spots of individual single artifacts. But all that information is important because what this is really is like a giant puzzle. So every piece of information contributes to the resolution of the larger picture. And now, so that's sort of some historical background on how the information that we know about was collected. Now I'd just like to go through that 10,000 year span of prehistoric occupation in general time periods so that you can get some idea of what that consists of. As I said, there's a large body of data, and the quality of that data is variable, mostly because some of the material that are in the artifact collections, not all the artifacts were provenience to specific sites. Some of them are just general locations, but it's still useful. The earliest evidence of prehistoric human settlement in the area we have goes back about at least 9,500, possibly 10,000 years ago to what we call the Paleo-Indian period. And these are some diagnostic or characteristic Paleo-Indian projectile points. They're what we call fluted points because they have a large single flake that was driven off the base of the point up into the center of the point. You can see it there. And that's very characteristic. Now these are quite rare. There's only been a few of these reported from the area, one possibly from the vicinity of Rhode Pond, a couple more reported from sites in Concord. So we don't know that much. It's an indication that people were here. We don't know much about what kind of resources they were using or much about how large the sites were that they created. Another thing that's an important factor is that the environment changed substantially over 10,000 years. The environments that we see out there today were not always like that. 10,000 years ago in this area, there was a mostly pine forest. It's a red pine forest with spruce, fir, large trees like that, which are more typical of a colder northern climate because this was a post-glacial environment, much cooler than and more moist than today. And so we had different environmental settings then, and those change gradually through time. By about 8,500 to 7,500 years ago, that changed to a warmer, drier climate, and that was marked by the expansion of a temperate deciduous forest with trees that we would recognize, oak, maple, ash, elm, birch, and beech. And the spread of that temperate forest corresponds really well with the spread of another cultural tradition marking what we call the early Archaic period, which spans from about 8,500 to maybe about 7,000, 7,500 years ago. This is a typical early Archaic projectile point. It's what we call a bifurcate base projectile point because it has this notched or bifurcated base. And again, this is a time period we don't know very much about. There have been a few finds of these points, mostly on the larger riverine zone base camps. We have enough of these points to know that people were here, that they occupied quite a few different sites. Most of the places, this group was sort of the pioneer group coming into the area. The sites that they used, they were sort of the first people to use those sites, and most of those sites were used continuously for 6,000 or 7,000 years after that. Good question.
How did you date them?
We just date them based on typology. In other words, we know from other sites in the Northeast where there's been radiocarbon dating done of fire pits or hearths or whatever that have these types of artifacts associated with them. And there's been enough of that background research done that we know that these points are what we would say diagnostic, or they're like the time markers. And the styles in the projectile points and other artifacts change through time, just the way styles change today. I mean, they changed a lot slower back then, but just as tail fins on cars vanished and things like that, it's a very similar kind of process. Early archaic bifurcate-based points like this have been found on about 10 sites in Sudbury and Concord drainage. There's about 15 or 16 of these that have been found, so they're not common, but they're important. And most of them were found by amateur archaeologists like Ben Smith. And fortunately, Smith did provenience pretty well where he found these things, and so that was good. We can do something with that data. But we don't know much about what they were doing here. We mostly just have the scattered find spots of these points. There's some range in the size of sites that they, in the locations rather of the sites that they occupied. Most of them are along the river. There's one site in Wayland that's located on an elevated sand and gravel terrace about a mile from the river. So that suggests that if we were able to collect more data on that time period, we'd probably see more of a diverse settlement pattern for that time period. A little bit later, between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, one of the really important environmental events was the establishment of oak forests in southern New England. That's a regional event. And these oak forests set up along a boundary or an ecotone that crossed New England in a general southwest to northeasterly direction. It went right across where Worcester County is now. And that's a very important boundary. And that took place during the general span of what we call the Middle Archaic period. And this seems to be a time when prehistoric people settled into group territories. In the prior periods, the Paleo-Indian and early Archaic, we think people or groups of hunter-gatherers had very large territories. They moved around a lot. With the establishment of this oak forest, people seem to settle into river basin or river drainage territories. And so what we see are more intensive occupations on sites. And that's a regional pattern. And it's been suggested that more sedentary settlement pattern developed in response to a more stable forest. That would be the oak forest ecosystem. And this is just a shot of a typical section of the Sudbury River to give you a view of that riverine environmental zone that was always a focal point of prehistoric activity. And when we get into the Middle Archaic period, we know about lots of sites from that time period that are right in this zone, right along the margins of the wetlands. And one of the significant things about the Sudbury-Concord drainage is that it's one of the regional concentrations of settlement in that Middle Archaic period, along with drainages like the Neponset, the Taunton, the Shawsheen drainage. It's recognized regionally as a concentration, and that's significant because not all river drainages have that. There's a clear indication that people came here very early, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, and they set up these territories, and it pretty much stayed that way for thousands of years. And probably a lot of that had to do with the establishment of essentially modern resources that we would recognize. Migratory waterfowl, fish runs, things like that. Those became more and more important. The much larger number of known Middle Archaic sites relative to earlier time periods, as I said, it provides evidence of extensive use of the Sudbury-Concord drainage by at least 7,000 years ago. And there seems to be a pretty intricate settlement pattern. We know more about site size and location than we did in prior periods. And they range from small sites, some of which are in upland settings away from the river, to some pretty large base camp sites in the riverine zone. And Middle Archaic toolkits from both large and small sites in various environmental settings give us indications of the initiation of seasonal movement within these river basin territories. In other words, they may have been on large base camp sites during a fish run or when migratory waterfowl were there, and then they may have moved to smaller upland zone sites to do deer hunting and things like that in the fall, early winter. And those are probably patterns that started very early and continued right up into the end of the prehistoric period. I'll just show you some typical Middle Archaic artifacts. These are projectile points called Stark points. These are interesting because they're all made from a local type of rock. It's called Westboro quartzite. And this is also important because we see people starting to really make a lot of use, really focus on these local lithic resources, these local rock types. They're not they're not getting rocks from further away, which they did in the early Archaic and Paleo-Indian periods. They're really focusing on the resources that are available in these river basins, and this is a good example of that. This is probably a Middle Archaic period woodworking tool, a gouge. It's a typical woodworking tool, and also this is when we start to see heavy woodworking tools like this. So again, there's that indication of adaptation to a forested environment, a lot of use of forest resources. Tools like this might have been used to manufacture a variety of wooden objects, including dugout canoes, things like that. Some more Middle Archaic projectile points. And these are chipped from a variety of material. They were using a lot of local quartzite and that type of material. These are materials that are not local, and we can sort of tell where they're from. A lot of them are from the sort of general Boston Basin area. In other words, that's the area that's pretty much east of where Route 128 is now. And these are fine-grained volcanic rocks that we call felsites. And for example, this type of volcanic rock, we have a pretty good idea it came from the Blue Hills area in Milton. This type maybe from the Middlesex Fells area, up in the area of Wakefield, Saugus, up in that area. This is probably also from the Wakefield area, this volcanic rock. These 2 points are made of argillite, which is sometimes called Cambridge argillite, which there are outcrops of in the northern part of the Boston Basin. So we can tell from these types of rock something about the resource exploitation territories. In other words, where people were getting their resources from. Some more points made out of local quartzite. Some of the important Middle Archaic sites in this area were near Herd Pond and what was known as the Castle Hill site in Wayland, and that site was salvaged by the Wayland Archaeology Group. It's now a town recreational field, soccer field, and those were large Middle Archaic base camps. Actually, the Herd Pond site is one of the more important Middle Archaic sites in the whole eastern, southeastern Mass region. There's a large collection of material from that site that's now in the Robbins Museum of Archaeology, which is maintained by the Mass Archaeological Society. It's down in Middleborough. It's one of the better known sites of that time period from the whole area. Another indication of local lithic resource use or use of local rocks during the Middle Archaic period comes from another material that's been locally called myelinite. It's a very distinctive kind of translucent sea green material, and outcrops of that have been found in a band extending from Sudbury up through the Lexington area up towards Burlington and Woburn. And it's so distinctive that we can pretty well pin it down. And these are some pieces of that material. And again, it's evidence of focus on local material. Somewhat later, after about 5,000 years ago in what we call the late Archaic period, we see evidence of really intensive, much more intensive use of sites than in the Middle Archaic period. And sites that that can be affiliated with various late archaic cultural traditions show the greatest frequency and the widest distribution in different environmental zones of probably any time period. And most of the surface collections from larger sites along the Sudbury River invariably contain diagnostic projectile points from 3 major cultural traditions in the late archaic, and I'll show you some material from those traditions. For example, the Ben Smith collection, mostly from Concord, contained late archaic projectile points of various types from 73 different sites in the Sudbury-Concord Assabet drainage, and about 80% of the sites investigated by Smith that could be placed in any time period had late archaic material. So that's a measure of the intensity of occupation, let's say between about 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. And we've been able to get some radiocarbon dates that fall in this time period from sites in this area. And they generally range between 4,500 and 2,900 years ago. And it's apparent that many site locations were being used. And that's what this graphic shows. This is a chart of about 30 radiocarbon dates that have been collected from various sites in the area, mostly in the Sudbury Assabet drainages. And they span from 6,500 years ago up to almost a period of European contact. The latest one is about 250 years ago. And you can see this is the number of dates that fall in. These are categories that are 500 years apart. Now this category right here is averages 4,250 years ago, and it clearly has the greatest frequency of radiocarbon dates. There are 9 dates that fall in that span between 4,250 years ago and 3,750 years ago, whereas in most 500-year brackets there are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 sites. So that's another indication that there was intensive use of sites in the area. Probably what was happening is that there may not have been a larger population. There just may have been more recurrent use of sites. People came back to sites much more frequently. And around that time, this area was covered by an oak-dominant forest with most of the species that we see in this area now: hickory beech, yellow birch, white pine, and some other species. So it really wasn't that much different. It's probably more like a forest that we would see now in maybe some upland areas of Worcester County. This is just quickly. This is how we obtain radiocarbon dates. This is a prehistoric fire pit or hearth feature. This site is in Westboro at the headwaters of the Sudbury River. And this is a fire pit or hearth feature. You can see this charcoal deposit down here. It's well down into the subsoil horizon. It's probably at least 18 to 24 inches below the modern surface. And charcoal would be collected from this deposit, probably not that much, probably 10 grams or less of charcoal, and be submitted to certain laboratories that carry out radiocarbon dating. And that's how we can date prehistoric occupations on sites. And when we find artifacts like projectile points in or around features like this is what we call them, a fire pit or hearth like that, then we can make those statements about when sites were occupied, and that's how we tell how old those points are, to answer your earlier question. It's this type of information. And some of the other evidence of intensive use of sites during the late Archaic period sometimes looks like this, and this is a feature made up of a lot of burned cobble and cobble fragments. These are mostly granite cobbles. Actually, this site is not around here, but it's a good example of this kind of construction on a site. And we think that what they were doing with these was some kind of resource processing, possibly smoking or drying fish, or baking some kind of plant food, where they would heat up rocks in a fire and then take almost like a clam bake, take the rocks someplace and put leaves or some other material on it, and then food, and maybe cover it up with earth. And so what you have left behind are these deposits of concentrated burnt rock fragments. And a lot of these have a little charcoal associated with them. And we find that many of these features date between 4,500 and 3,000 years ago. And that's a very big regional pattern in eastern and southeastern Massachusetts. So that's some of the other evidence of really intensive late archaic occupation. These are projectile points that are diagnostic of what we call the Laurentian tradition, and they date from about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. And they're usually made out of fine-grained volcanic rocks, felsites and quartzite is very typical. And they mostly appear on sites that were used earlier during the Middle Archaic period. In the Sudbury drainage at the Charlestown Meadows site in Westboro, some good radiocarbon dates dating, which range from around 5,200 years ago to 4,300 years ago, have been obtained from deposits that contain these kinds of Laurentian tradition artifacts. A little bit later, probably about 4,500 years ago, we see occupations on sites by what's called the small stem point tradition. And these are some characteristic small triangular points of that tradition. And the most diversified settlement and resource use patterns are illustrated by sites that belong to the small stem point tradition. Most of the large riverine zone base camps that were used in prior periods, such as the Herd Pond site in Wayland, the Davis Farm site in Sudbury, were probably base camps at this time. And large numbers of projectile points like this and like this have been collected from those sites. The Ben Smith collection, for example, contained over 60 of these what we call small stemmed points just from one site, the Davis Farm site alone. So if frequency of projectile points is any indication of the intensity of occupation, that was a very frequently used site. And it seems as though people of this tradition were using riverine resources like most people, but they also exploited a lot of upland zone environmental settings. And we know about some smaller sites that are on that tributary stream network in the upland areas. This is a typical kind of upland tributary stream environmental setting where you would see small sites in that late archaic small stem point tradition. It seems as though people of this tradition made a lot of use of the smaller sort of micro environments, places that other people necessarily didn't use, and it may be an aspect of their adaptation to the area. That it's something that is becoming noticeable, that we see as a pretty broad pattern. For example, there was a survey done in the Ipswich and Shawsheen rivers in the Burlington, North Reading area, and quite a few sites with small stem point material were found in settings like this at distances of a couple of miles from the main branch of the Shawsheen and the Ipswich River. And there's been a general model of late archaic settlement that suggests that hunter-gatherer groups occupied relatively small territories in river drainages, and they developed adaptations or subsistence strategies based on a wide range of resources. In other words, they were very familiar with and used a lot of resources, probably not just large mammals like deer, but a lot of medium and small size mammals and a lot of plant resources as well. So they had sort of a broad spectrum approach to resource use. These micro environments in places like this that were not used by people of earlier traditions or later time periods have sites of this late archaic small stem point tradition. And one of the major environmental events around this time seems to be some changes in wetlands in the area, and we know this from fossil pollen research that's been done. Sediment cores of peat and silt from major wetlands and ponds that have been taken and analyzed for fossil pollen tell us how the structure and the size of wetlands changed through time. And it seems that between about 4,000 and 3,000 years ago, there were some significant changes in the size and the vegetation in those wetlands, and it's possible that that had some kind of an effect on prehistoric settlements, so that people needed to sort of spread out and use more resources. The other late archaic cultural tradition is what's called the Susquehanna tradition, because it was first identified along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. And there are three really important sites in the Sudbury area that contained cremation burial deposits that belong to this tradition. And in fact, these three sites were used to basically define a lot of what we know about that tradition. And those sites were the Mansion Inn Cemetery, which was located in Wayland, the Vincent site, which was right here in Sudbury at the foot of Knobscott Hill, and a site in North Billerica called known as the Call site. And the Vincent site was a single example of a cremation burial pit. The Mansion Inn site in Wayland was a large cemetery with a lot of cremation burials, and we were able to get a radiocarbon date from the Vincent site of about 3,400 years ago. So that's a nice radiocarbon date that's from right in this area. And some of the typical artifacts that were placed in those cremation burial features, from those artifacts we can get an idea of the toolkits that were being used. This is a pestle or grinding stone made out of hard slate or argillite. This type of tool would have been used to possibly grind plant food. We know that because we found carbonized hickory nut shells in fire pits, that was another forest resource that was being used. This type of tool might have been used to process that sort of food. There are also a variety of chipstone tools, these basic sort of tool blade forms. And these actually may have been in a cremation burial feature. Because they're light color, that light gray color is probably due to the fact that they were burned. These are artifacts that I saw. They were brought in from somebody had found them in Framingham. It's possible that they were even from the Mansion Inn site itself. These are some other burned artifacts, possibly from the Mansion Inn site. You can see that chalky white color, some projectile points. Another thing that took place during the late archaic period, particularly with this tradition, the Susquehanna tradition, was quarrying of soapstone or steatite from quarries in a part of Worcester County, mostly in the Blackstone Valley south of Worcester. And what they would do with this material was to carve cooking vessels or pots. And these are a couple of examples of unfinished soapstone cooking vessels from that area. And there was at least one soapstone cooking vessel of this type found in the Mansion Inn Cemetery. And that's a very characteristic type of artifact. And in addition to these cemetery sites, there have been some small sites located along tributary streams in this area with diagnostic Susquehanna tradition artifacts like this blade. And in fact, these are called Mansion Inn blades, named after the site in Wayland. That's become sort of the type site for this kind of artifact. And during what we call the terminal archaic period, a lot of the same site locations that had been used in the late archaic were continue to be occupied for about the next 600 or 700 years, from about 3,200 to 2,500 years ago. And these are diagnostic terminal archaic to early woodland period points that we call Orient fishtail points, because they have sort of that, if you look at them sort of sideways, they have sort of a fishtail basal shape. And these have been recorded from most of the large base camp sites in the Sudbury Concord drainage. And while most of the known sites from that time period are in the riverine zone, we know about a few sites marked by diagnostic points like this that are along upland tributary streams. And this sort of general lack of information about settlement in this time period from those upland areas is typical of that bias that I showed you earlier in the distribution of sites. Most of the known sites are along the river. A few are in upland areas. Question?
Are most of these points that you have here spears or arrows?
Well, it's hard to say. That's why we just call them projectile points, because we don't you could make a general assessment based on their size. Most of these would be fairly large for use on arrow shafts, so we assume that they're spear
For fish and things?
points, probably mostly for large to medium-sized mammals.
You've
Yeah.
been mentioning volcanic rock.
Right.
Where would that come from here? Dikes?
Yeah, there are a number of locations, again, in that Boston Basin area. The Blue Hills is one of the major source areas, the Middlesex Fells area in that area, where there are formations of these fine-grained, flinty volcanic rocks, and those were a primary resource that were used by prehistoric people for thousands of years, and they would obtain that either directly or indirectly by trade, probably.
Would they come from, did they actually have volcanoes here?
Yeah, but you
Or
have
were
to
they
go
dikes?
back hundreds of millions of years, and apparently there were volcanoes. But that's back in geological time. Let me just continue, and then I'll answer any questions you have when I finish up. Yeah, again, this is a typical kind of upland setting where we don't know a lot about the sites. And again, that change in regional wetlands that we have some indications of, that continues into this terminal archaic to early woodland period, 3,500 to about 2,500 years ago. We had done some public archaeology lab that I've worked for. Actually, we had done some fossil pollen research in connection with research along the I-495 highway corridor in the Taunton-Norton area. One of the things that we found out from that was the pollen core, or the sediment cores from a large wetland down there showed evidence of a local dry period, a local dry phase. We thought that that might be a larger regional event, and it could have affected prehistoric settlement. One of the other things that happens during this time period is that there's a strong shift of settlement to the coastal zone, because one of the other major environmental events is the stabilization of sea level rise. Since the melting of the glaciers 13,000 or 14,000 years ago, there was a steady, gradual rise in sea level. And sea level stabilized about 3,000 to 2,500 years ago in most of southern New England. And what happened as a consequence of that is that you had the formation of tidal flats, and with that came a lot of shellfish beds that once sea level stabilized, it was these various species of shellfish sort of took root, and that was an important resource for prehistoric people. So it's been speculated that people may have abandoned some of these interior upland areas, like the Sudbury Concord drainage, and shifted settlement more towards the coast. Now, that's a type of general model that's been proposed, but from what I've seen in this area, there are still a lot of sites from that time period in these interior upland river drainages. So everybody didn't just abandon this area and move to the coast. It's possible that what happened was that there was some kind of settlement shift, and people may have been more dispersed and using a lot of smaller sites at that time period. Now, another problem is there's a recognition problem. A lot of the identification of sites from what we call the early woodland period, again about 3,000 to 2,500 years ago, is reliant on certain projectile points, like these orient fishtail points I showed you. Now, these are not that common. If you look through most of the larger collections, there are not that many of them. And what we found out from research in other parts of eastern Massachusetts is that these small stem point projectiles lasted a lot longer than was previously thought. They were probably in use up until about 2,500 years ago. So it seems that they might be a better indication of occupation during that time period. And these are very widespread. Somewhat later, in the transition from the early woodland to middle woodland period, about 2,000 years ago, throughout the whole southern Merrimack Basin, there's an expansion of settlement patterns. There seems to be more sites in these areas in comparison to that early woodland period. And again, that's a larger pattern. One study that had been done of prehistoric ceramics from the southern Merrimack Basin suggested that based on the decoration techniques on the ceramics, that the groups in this area were using a lot of the same decoration techniques. So there was a lot of communication between the groups in that time period. And one of the other significant patterns in the Middle Woodland period is the use of a lot of unusual, non-local, or what we would call exotic types of stone. These are types of stone that don't occur naturally in southern New England. We can pretty well tell they're from sources in New York, Pennsylvania, really far away. And the most likely explanation for how they got here is through some kind of trade or exchange networks. And that's sort of a feature of this Middle Woodland period. And we're not sure why people started to do that, why it was important to get this stone from really far away. It may have had something to do with status or reinforcing some kind of social connections or networks, things like that. These are a couple of diagnostic Middle Woodland projectile points that are made of that exotic material. In this case, it's chert or flint, probably from eastern or central New York. And there's actually quite a lot of that material that was traded into southern New England at that time period. It's a very distinct pattern. Another material is a yellow or tan jasper that we're pretty sure is from sources in eastern or southeastern Pennsylvania. There's another distinctive type of rock that comes out of the Blue Hills area that appears with the non-local flint and jasper in Middle Woodland sites, and so that's one of the really distinct patterns. Another thing that's happening is that in the woodland period in general, one of the technological innovations is the abandonment of soapstone or steatite cooking vessels, and people begin to manufacture ceramic pots or cooking vessels. And I don't have a whole reconstructed pot to show you, but this is a sherd of a typical Middle Woodland ceramic vessel, and it's sort of like a coarse, low-fired earthenware or terracotta, and the pits or holes in this piece that you can see are from where the temper has leached out. A lot of these ceramics were tempered with shell, and in the acid subsoil that we have around here, that shell just completely dissolves, and it just leaves these pits. Other ceramic types were tempered with crushed up burned granite, sometimes burnt quartz, and that's one of the big sort of technological innovations or advances of that time period. Now locally in this area, a lot of the big riverine zone sites that have been used throughout the Archaic period continued to be used in the woodland period. And there's some, on one site in Wayland, we found there was some good evidence of this found. There were several large circular features made up of burnt rock. They were about 2 or 3 meters, about 10 or 12 feet in diameter. And they appear to have been used possibly for smoking or drying fish. The soil, the fill in those features was very black and greasy. And also this site was located in what's known as the Weir Meadow area. It's in the Weir Hill area. And that's historically known as a location of fish weirs. So it's probable that use of that area went back quite far into prehistory. And you can, if you read the history of Sudbury by Hudson, there's some interesting discussion of that in there. And some radiocarbon dates from those features range from about 1600 to about 400 years ago, and they fall pretty well within the middle to late woodland period. Another site around Hockomonco Pond in Westboro. This is just a view of that pond. It's at the headwaters of the Sudbury River. Some very similar circular burnt rock features were found there, and they contain some of that exotic, non-local chert or flint, probably from New York State, and they seem to be have been used by Middle Woodland people, again, possibly for smoking or drying fish that may have been caught in this pond Some of these ponds may have been parts of anadromous fish runs. There may have been alewives or other species that ran all the way up the river and spawned in these ponds. So that gives us some idea of the kinds of resources that were important. Also in the upper Sudbury area in Westboro, in what's been designated as the Cedar Swamp Archaeological District, the Ekblot chapter of the Mass Archaeological Society has been doing a lot of research in that area over about the last 10 years, and they've been able to radiocarbon date some middle woodland sites to between 1,200 and about 1,000 years ago, and so they provide good evidence of settlement in that time period in this more upland kind of terrain, as well as, so that provides a good complement to the sites that we have along the middle and the lower Sudbury River. Somewhat later, in what's known as the late woodland period, which is about from about 1,000 to 500 years ago, this continuity in the use of site locations from the middle woodland period. Some of the important sites occupied in the late woodland period were most of these sites are destroyed now. There was one near Baldwin Pond, which is now the Wayland Golf Course, and near Herd Pond. And again, these were probably important fishing stations. Both of those ponds are connected to the river by short streams, so they may have been good spawning areas for these anadromous fish. And one of the regional environmental events that we have a clue of about 1,000 years ago from this fossil pollen research is there seems to be evidence for forest clearance. And the way that shows up in a pollen diagram is that you have pollen of certain plants that only grow on disturbed soil, such as ragweed and things like that, things that we would recognize as weeds now. And those are indications of opening in the forest canopy. So it's possible that by 1,000 years ago there was some clearing of the forest for early agriculture. It's actually more like horticulture, where there would be sort of a slash and burn type pattern where small plots would be cleared in the forest, possibly to plant corn or beans or squash, the three major domesticated plants. That's one of the things that the big mysteries that we don't really know much about is when those domesticated plants were brought into New England. We know that in places like even New York State in the Midwest, domesticated plants were being used fairly early, probably maybe as long ago as 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. But we don't know when that was initiated here. We just don't have enough good evidence. These are some diagnostic late woodland projectile points. Now these are the kinds of points that Native American groups in this area would have been using at the time of European contact, right up into the early 17th century. Just by way of interest, this point here is made of that tan jasper that we think is possibly from Pennsylvania. Most of the rest of them are made of local material, some of that volcanic rock, local quartz. One of the other things that happens is that there seems to be a shift back to use of local types of stone as opposed to use of a lot of that exotic material in the middle woodland. In the late woodland, people go back to using more of the local quartz and quartzite. I've seen that in this area. And that's been interpreted as indication of people settling back into more localized territory, those trade and exchange networks that brought the jasper from Pennsylvania and the flint from New York State into the area seem to have broken down or dissolved, or they just weren't important for some reason, and people go back to more local resource use. And it's one of the ironies is that although that part of the prehistoric period is not that long ago, speaking in archaeological time, 500 to 1,000 years ago, we really don't know a lot about what people were doing, even compared to what was going on here 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Very few late woodland period sites or sites that date to the time of European contact have been documented in this area. There were apparently some traditional Native American land holdings, including one on the fall line on the Sudbury River in Saxonville, about where the Roxbury carpet factory was built later in the 19th century. And that general area is described in a mid-17th century deed. I believe that's either in Hudson's History of Sudbury or in the History of Framingham by Temple. And it's clear that that was an important area for local Native American groups. These are just some typical late woodland ceramic sherds. These are rim sherds up near the top of a vessel, which is where most of the decoration is. These, again, would be tempered with shell or fine sand. This one was from a very large vessel, probably held a couple of gallons, almost like a large cauldron, probably would have been about that tall. These are typical kinds of decoration techniques. This might have been, this is a stamping pattern that might have been done with the edge of a scallop shell or some type of shell, or possibly a comb, a wooden or a bone comb. These are incised line decorations that are fairly diagnostic of that period. This is a map of early 17th century Framingham. This is from Temple's History of Framingham, and this area around the fall line in Saxonville, which is up here. Here's Lake Cochituate Brook. This area up in here, it's hard to see, but it's right here it says the Falls. There's that deed that I referred to talks about this area in here being transferred from an Indian, I believe his name was William Bowman, to, I think, John Stone, or one of the early English settlers, one of the early people in the Framingham plantation. And also there are references in Temple to a very large prehistoric site being located up here somewhere. Apparently some burials were found there. It's likely that that was a site that was occupied in the late prehistoric period from all the evidence. That site's pretty well destroyed. There was a lot of residential development there in the 19th century. There's a large sand and gravel pit in there now. But you can tell from the pieces of evidence that that's probably where a late prehistoric period settlement was. Another important feature is this major trail system, the Old Connecticut Path. Now that, the fall line and that settlement near Cochituate Brook, and there also were some fish weirs apparently in Cochituate Brook, would have been right along the, very close to the alignment of the Old Connecticut Path. And that was a part of a important trail or transportation network that for really all of southeastern New England. So that's something that we have here in this area that really connected this area with a lot of other places, and it was important. It's also significant that the late Archaic period Mansion Inn Cemetery was located very close to probably where the Old Connecticut Trail passed. It was that site was on West Plain Street, and the Old Connecticut Path probably followed or went very, very near to that. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that we can see in historic period documentation that probably extended back into the prehistoric period. That trail probably was used over a very long period of time. There's some other locations, including Neshodic Hill in Concord, and Mill Brook in Concord, in what's now Concord Center. There are references to burials being found near Neshodic Hill that were probably, again, late prehistoric or European contact period burials. There was alleged to have been a fish weir on Mill Brook when the first English settlers came there in the mid to late 1630s. Another area here in Sudbury is the Weir Meadow or Weir Hill area. And again, if you read in Hudson's History of Sudbury, you'll see the references to that as a traditional Native American fishing area. And this is just a slide showing that. And what's interesting about that is that it's one of the few areas where there's a narrow constriction in the river meadow. So it was a very well-selected spot if you were going to set up fish weirs or fish traps. It's sort of a narrow neck in the river meadow. Most of the other areas around there, you have as much as a half a mile of marsh between dry ground and the river channel. But in this area, you have Weir Hill on this side and some dry ground on the Whalen side forming this neck. So it was it's sort of a strategic location, and that's the apparently where some of these late prehistoric or early historic period Indian fish traps or weirs were set up. And the apparent, as I said, the apparent absence of late prehistoric sites or proto-historic to contact period sites is surprising, but it may be due to several factors, including decreased population from some early epidemics. We know there were some major epidemics that went through eastern Massachusetts even before the English got here, prior to 1620, that may have depleted the population. Some of the late prehistoric contact period sites, like that one in Saxonville and actually Concord Center, and possibly even the original Sudbury plantation over in Whalen, may have been Native American settlements that were reoccupied by the English, and so a lot of the evidence of any native occupation has been wiped out. And also there may have been a shift in settlement to coastal zones. A lot of the better documented contact period Native American sites are for example, in the Boston Harbor area, places like Lynn, Saugus, Revere Beach, the mouth of the Neponset River. And it's clear that there were major concentrations of settlement there, so those may be factors. I'll end there and leave some time for questions, if we have any. Yes, let me start here in the front row.
Mr. Ritchie, have you considered that in that middle woodland period, the presence of the other substances that were used to make the projectiles might have been expeditionary efforts of other tribes?
Yeah, that's been proposed, and in fact, it's been referred to as the Star Wars theory because we know at that time there were very strong political groups, probably, for example, in the Ohio Valley, there were very strong political systems out there. That's when you have mound building and monumental earthwork building in the Ohio Valley and even into western and central New York.
The reason I ask is I believe I found some arrowheads that, from what you've shown me tonight, were from different periods.
Really? Yeah.
And given one would seem to have been made of kind of a flint material, the other was that black material,
Right.
paper.
Right.
I thought it might have been two conflicting tribes.
It's possible. I mean, there's a lot we don't know. I mean, we don't know.
Animals that were shooting at each other.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, we don't know the exact mechanisms for how or why that material got in here. I mean, the most common explanation is that for some reason it was important to get that material, either for prestige reasons or there was information that was coming along with that material from a central powerful place. But yeah, it's a possibility that there could have been physical movement
One more
of people
question.
with that
If
shirt.
such material as that is found by someone who, like myself, doesn't do it on even a casual basis, is there a place where one can turn in that information?
Yeah, I would say to start even right here with the Sudbury Historical Commission or the Whalen Archaeology Group, and eventually that information should probably go to the Mass Historical Commission in Boston, because they have a statewide inventory of prehistoric sites that they maintain, and that's the big database for the Commonwealth, and they're always interested in adding information to that database because they use that for planning purposes. So if you or anybody else has what seems to be unrecorded prehistoric sites, that's good to know about. I'd be interested in that myself.
Duncan?
So, Paul, yeah. Let me-
I might just mention, I'm Paul Gardescu, coordinator of the Wayland Archaeology Group. And last year, someone said, I was planting a tree, I came on this arrowhead, what do you know about it? And this was in the fall. It was a rather unusual point. We went out, located exactly where it was, and then when the ground thawed out next spring, did some exploratory digging also to see whether it was a single arrow head or represented an area of activity. But we also then registered it with the State Historic Commission. So took photographs of it, measured it, identified as well as we could what it was, and this was another fine spot. And any of you who would like hands-on experience digging, sorting, chipping debris, listing, counting, I'd be glad to talk with you afterwards.
Yes, over here.
The subject of a different lecture. What about going over the 10,000 years of the skeletons of people, the bones and stuff?
That's a good question. They're pretty rare because one of the things that archaeologists have to deal with in southern New England is that we have very acid soil. So anybody who does gardening, if you've got a pH kit, you can see that. I mean, a lot of the average pH is about 4.5 or 5. It's very acid, and what that does is that dissolves organic material. So bone, unless it's burned, might last, 500, 1,000 years, not that long. And also it depends on the drainage characteristics of the soil that it's buried in. We find a lot of burned animal bone, bird and mammal bone on prehistoric sites that's very old, but it's because it's been burned and all the organic content is gone. It's just the mineral content of the bone that's left. So unburnt bone doesn't last very long at all. So prehistoric burials, unless they were cremations, are pretty rare. So unfortunately, we don't know a lot about burial customs and things like that. It's mostly the cremation burials in cemeteries like the Vincent site here near Knobscott and the Mansion Inn Cemetery in Wayland that we have that information from. And in the cremations, the bone is very fragmented. So, but that's a good question.
Where would you turn in something like that?
Actually, now there's that's under the jurisdiction of the Commission on Indian Affairs in Massachusetts. They have an agreement with, actually by statute, unmarked burials of any kind of Native American burials are protected by law. That was not the case until just a few years ago.
Would they do paleontology on it?
Well, Commission on Indian Affairs would coordinate with the Massachusetts Historical Commission with the State Archaeologist's Office too. They work out a disposition for any suspected or verified Native American remains that come up either accidentally during construction or if archaeologists like myself find them. We're required to do that, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, that's who you should contact. Yeah, inform me.
Many years ago, I was given what I was told was an artifact. They called them Indian paint pots,
Oh, yeah.
and they were found on Long Island. Do you know anything about them?
Yeah, they're probably what geologists would call concretion. In other words, it's sort of a hollow formation of like an iron-rich clay or something like that, and if those are split open, there's sort of an ochre-like material inside, like a yellow ochre, and if you heat that up, it would probably turn red, and yeah, that was used by prehistoric people.
What for?
Pigments of paint. If you mixed it with grease, you could make paint out of it, or just as a natural mineral pigment. But yeah, we don't find too much of that around here. But I know that there are prehistoric burials that were found on the eastern end of Long Island, and they did find those paint pots or ochre pigment stones in those.
Duncan, excuse me.
Yeah.
I think the questions are ready, and since you're going to be around until we leave, if people have questions, I'm sure they can approach you during the break.
Sure. Okay,
Thank
I'll
you for
defer to. Yeah, if you have questions, come up and ask me.